Yes, well, I think it's important to note that nothing is set in stone here. We do know, of course, relatively power is shifting. We know that it's not new. The focus we've had in the last few weeks, months, is merely demonstrative of the trend. We know that. But the question of where we go from here is, of course, in our own destiny. Look, firstly, within the West, if we look at the relationship between Europe and America, what we choose to do as Europeans or Americans will have an impact upon how that goes. If Europe turns in on itself, if it stops spending money on its military, if it loses that leg of what you need to be a global power, you have to have economic power and military power, then the US will quite rightly say, well, we're not interested in Europe anymore. You can, kind of decline in terms of what you're doing because you're not willing to make the security role in the world a priority in terms of your policy. So it's simple. Equally in America, if American leaders decide to make the most of the gifts of that particular nation in terms of economic and military might, they can arrest and manage that relative decline quite well. They can balance the movement going forward, looking at China, neither judging yet whether it can be a competitor or indeed a friend as to how that goes forward, or they can take one of those tracks and it will lead to reactions. It really is the matter, people discuss this as if it's sort of set in stone, it's all over, we're just hand-wringing in general. We still have a tremendous control over our own destiny here. Okay, well, there's so much there, and we can take, different parts of it. Let's look at this issue of ambiguity. Yes, of course you don't want to give the game away, but I suspect we're not even playing the same game at the moment within Europe. That's part of the problem. We're talking at cross purposes in terms of where we'd like to go and go forward. And one thing we've seen in the Eurozone crisis is that, of course, the markets are thriving on, or rather reacting to uncertainty. You have to give the markets some certainty of knowing where they're going to be in order to stop attack on attack on attack on each of the Eurozone countries. And that's why you've seen the focus move on and on and on. You sort one issue out, it moves to the next country. You go on and you continue. The problem being there's no global solution that's going to solve the Eurozone issue. And this, I think, is the reason why it's so toxic globally as well, because you have the situation where you've got 17 countries where this could go, and it's interesting to note that, of course, the German economy is in a much better shape than any of the others, but even there, it's interesting to see what the reaction was if anyone was following the bond yield prices on Thursday and Friday, that the Germans were suffering somewhat in relation to the UK-US treasuries in terms of people buying. So there's clearly a confidence issue that's going right across the Eurozone that's problematic. And again, you're quite right, the Americans are not, potentially a much bigger problem in 2012, 2013, but debt to GDP ratio is but one measure that we're looking at in terms of confidence. The markets have confidence, I suppose, ultimately in America because they know the growth will be there in America to get out of it and to pay the debt. The problem some of the European countries, and you saw this most recently with Italy, of course, is that there is no confidence that the growth will be there to get out of it. And that is an issue that Eurozone is going to have to look at and deal with as well. So once again, I think ambiguity is fine to a point, but you have to start delivering some answers in order to reassure the markets and ensure that things don't get worse. That doesn't take into account the democratic process and the importance of getting buy-in from people into our economic systems. I mean, part of the problem, I think, of the whole Eurozone has been that essentially there was no public approval for this long term. Yes, governments were elected, and it's a question of if we're going to continue down this and we're going to continue down the realm of trying to solve all the problems technocratically, we will run into huge political backlashes. And the last time we saw this happening, the problems, as we know, were in the 1930s. We don't want to go down that route again.
And if someone asks for a referendum, he's getting slapped by a chancellor.
Yeah, but this goes to the heart of it. It's about Europe's confidence. Do European leaders have the confidence to embrace that vision that you just articulated, Anne-Marie? I don't think they do at the moment. They used to have some kind of notion of confidence. It hasn't been in evidence for the last 5-6 years. Until they recover that, you're going to have those questions continually being asked, and they need to, come a step forward to say, we remain a great power, great powers in the plural. We remain capable and willing to have an outward role in the world. We're not just going to sit here passively and just be a trading set of nations. We have values to spread. We have prosperity to spread. We even have the capability to intervene militarily if necessary. But all that stems from the confidence of leaders to stand up and say it, and for the confidence of people to follow them. It's that simple.
Identity crisis.
I think I'm militarily with you and emotionally with you in terms of how this kind of works. And look, when it comes to the cuts in troops, obviously we expect it to happen. The budgetary pressures along those lines, but the timing is going to be key, and the implications of what that means are key. And we must think of the following as well. When US planners are thinking about where they're cutting, strategically down the line, where is it that instability is likely to occur? Are we going to need those bases because of what's going to happen in North Africa? We've seen we're quite unclear where the Arab Spring is going to lead. Those bases may well serve a purpose. And any time you look at the strategic cuts that are proposed in any country, you have to think, well, are they actually being driven more by budgetary needs, or are they being driven more by strategic understanding? And that's the notion there. But I do want to quickly come back to the question there, the philosophical question. This is actually a key one, because we do face a challenge, to values here in terms of state capitalism versus the free market capitalism system that we've seen. And currently we're not answering it very well. Currently we're floundering with our responses. It seems that our model, which, let's be frank, has been the basis of democracy, liberty, prosperity for the last 300 years, is coming under sustained pressure because there are others in the world who have different models right now, who are doing better and who see that this may well be the path to follow. And if those countries continue to develop in the way that they have been, others may join that bandwagon in terms of the other. I think we're at quite a pivot in terms of how capitalism develops, and I think it's necessary for our leaders and our business leaders as well, because a lot of this is rooted in business behavior, to understand the challenge is not simply about how to restore profitability, but how to restore the values lead that we've always had over other systems as well.
It does raise the question, so let's do it here, which we're seeing the Arab Spring, about which the outcome is very unclear, and a misapprehension, I think, on the part of some that this is about democracy, which is also very unclear. And then in the West, things like the Occupy movement. Do any of you take that seriously in terms of what it represents? Go ahead.
Well, I can certainly have a go at that. I mean, I think it's interesting looking at the Occupy movement. I don't think it's a movement in the way that we've traditionally understood these things. If you actually go and speak to protesters, you'll find there's a whole selection of different reasons why they're there. There isn't one overarching reason. Some people want to have a better safeguard in the system. Others want to overthrow it entirely. There's no sort of one coherent identity. But I think much more dangerous than that is the feeling on the so-called street, to coin those words, or the ordinary man, to use a horrible phrase in this sense. If you think about someone on a national average wage over the last few years, you think about the anger that's built up. Their purchasing power has gone down over the last 2-3 years. Commodity prices have risen. They can't get a mortgage, say. They can't get a loan very easily because liquidity is dried up. Everything's becoming more expensive. They may have been thrown out of work, or someone's been thrown out of work that they know. It looks very difficult for them to come back. And at the same time, they're seeing sort of largesse in financial institutions, other places. You can begin to see why there might be a notion of dangerous anger there, that while the Occupy movement is but an amorphous mass of people, there is a very real danger beneath that psychologically people's mood towards the system it has turned vitriolic as opposed to merely just angry, and they may be prepared to embrace solutions that they wouldn't have done 2-3 years ago, which will of course damage the system. Leading on from that comment, I think your key point is in Europe, the question of whether you're going to have more centralization is tied into this question of accountability and democratic approval for it. This is the whole problem we faced in the last 10-15 years. There really hasn't been political buy-in. Maybe the case wasn't made, or it didn't want to be made, or people refused to take the results when they came out in a certain way on that process. And as a result, if you're thinking of pushing for more centralization now, when we're already increasingly down that line, without getting the political buy-in to that, aren't you just repeating the problems of before? I mean, you are. You're going to continuously go down this route of a small group of people deciding, well, what we need is more centralization, ever larger numbers of people feeling dislocated as a result, and if the fix doesn't work and you have to keep on coming back to it, where does that lead you democratically? Where does that lead you to the political buy-in for your financial project? It doesn't exist, and that's the problem. Okay, and to coin a trite phrase, every crisis creates an opportunity. Now, that opportunity may not be ours in this crisis. It's China and others who see this as their chance to buy things up on the cheap, to gain their strategic levers, as has been suggested, and to use that in advance. If you look at history over time, when you saw the economic primacy shift from Europe to America, and specifically between Britain and America, used through crisis in the case of world wars, in terms of how, in a sense, the financial system reacted, how the US was able to use those to its advantage in terms of leveraging its financial power for the future. And I think we'll discover 2-3 years down the line exactly how this process has worked. Now, of course, in some cases, you've seen some reactions to it. I'll give you one rather random example. In Iceland, there's been this issue of a Chinese citizen trying to buy up about 2% of Iceland, looking at this and trying to think of it strategically. It's actually caused quite an interesting stir within Iceland, which of course has had its share of financial problems. And the reaction there, though, has been, look, this actually may be a bad thing to sell, this amount of land to someone who, although is a private individual, may have some connection, with the government. It may lead to future problems. So I think people have to start considering strategically what the nature of asking China for handouts is and moving forward in that. The question shows both the strengths and the weaknesses of opinion polling. I mean, if you look at the strengths, opinion polling is a snapshot of public opinion at any one time. If you look at the weaknesses, opinion polling is a snapshot of public opinion at any one time. It's the same thing. It's a set of attitudes at one moment, looking at how people consider things right then and there. Now, obviously, if you go to the emerging economies, they're going to feel confident. Look around you. The pace of change is so dramatic. You can't help but feel uplifted. And in a much quicker way than we saw 100, 200 years ago in our economies. It's going to happen. But at the same time, look, we have reinvented ourselves constantly, time and time again. What we have to do to make sure that this continues is indeed to feed into the idea that the capitalist system that we have today is indeed the system that best leads to prosperity for everyone. If that means tinkering around the edges, if that means business leaders reacting accordingly or governments reacting accordingly to do so, then it needs to happen. And once we do that, we too can aspire to that same level of confidence. We've done it before.
A British student who was trained at the Ivy Leagues and in America, and he was taking his business degree in Hyderabad, India. And I said, why had he chosen that? And he looked at me as if I had three heads and said, because this is where the future is. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Alan Mendoza, Jim Hogue, and Carl Theodor zu Guttenberg. You were brilliant. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also let's have a round of applause for Pamela for a wonderful moderation of the session. Now we have time for a lunch break, and there are two very good reasons why you must be back in time at 2:30. The first is that Ehud Barak, the Israeli Defense Minister, is going to be interviewed, and the second reason is that he's going to be interviewed by me. So please be back on time. Thanks very much.